Coach, let's talk a little bit about your scaffolding that I saw you using inside your classroom. I know you were kind of working on the vocabulary, but kind of tell me about the vocabulary that day that you had involved with the lesson.
Okay, well, radicals is just like a stepping stone to get to the big picture of the quadratics. So I go over what a radical is, the parts of the radical, which are the radical itself, the index, which tells you which power you're going to, whether it's to the second power, third power, fourth power, and then the radicand, which is the number that's underneath what we call the house, which is the radical. Those were the main just vocabulary words for this lesson, and like I said, this is a bigger picture. When we get to quadratics, this is just like a stepping stone, so that they'll know what to do when we get to quadratics.
Yeah, math is one of those subjects a little bit easier to scaffold than others, I guess, because you're always just teaching a little bit of a chunk, and then I guess you're going on with the big chunk. Did you I didn't get to see the beginning, and we were talking about it. Did you get to use anything at the beginning of the lesson to kind of like assess what the students already know, or did you do anything in that class that day so you can kind of gauge of how much knowledge or of the content they already had?
A little bit. I mean, just like the basic understanding of what a radical is and how it becomes a radical. We talked about perfect squares being 6 times 6, 9 times 9. Just to see if they would catch on to what that was and what that meant. And basically they could do, like I said earlier, the easy ones that are perfect squares. And so I kind of built on that as we went. So.
And this was a day after a test too, right? So this was like the very first lesson of the unit, and so it was the first chunk of a bigger chunk that you were hoping to build, I guess, right?
Yes, sir.
Tell me about your graphic organizer. I know you said you had that chart, and you also had where you're working the problems on the board. I know you don't get to get around as much. She has a broken foot; you can't see that. Kind of tell me about your graphic organizers and how you use that and how you think it helps those kids.
Okay, a lot of times, like at the beginning of the period when we first started the radicals, I had like on a half a sheet of paper a huge radical, and then I had the parts where we could label them, and so they would have to label as I did on the board and write down what the parts were. And then a lot of times at the end of the period, I'll give them that same thing as a ticket out the door. And so I'll see if they can remember what the parts were. So it's like the same thing as I did it as a warm-up, but that's their ticket out the door. Can they remember what I just told them from the beginning of the lesson?
Right.
So I use that sometimes as a graphic organizer. But the other graphic organizer that I gave them was like I tell them it's their little cheat sheet, and I do allow them to use it on a test. But it's basically the powers of 2 from 1 to 20 something. I can't remember exactly. And then the powers of 3, powers of 4, and the powers of 5.
Right.
And so they're allowed to use that on homework. They're allowed to use it with quizzes, or they're allowed to use it with tests. And so that's just one small way of differentiation for those who can't remember what's a perfect square.
The one thing, as I was observing you, I think your levels of continuous assessment as you were going through was really strong. Kind of take me through as a teacher. You're in a class of 14 students, which is nice to have such a small class. It helps with learning. Kind of tell me a little bit how you assess a group during a lesson while you're teaching. I mean, I noticed several ways that you did it that day. Okay. Just kind of, let's just talk through that real quick on how you assess as you're teaching.
Okay. Well, I use a couple of variety of ways. One way is I'll do 4 or 5 examples, practice problems with them, and then I have what I call U-tries. And so I'll give them usually it's 2 or 3, and they're to do the U-tries themselves And I will usually walk around the room and I'll look at their paper and say, see if they're on the right track, or, correct small mistakes maybe. And another way, I also have whiteboards where they can write the problem out on the whiteboard. It's probably a 12 by 12, and they have their own little marker and their own little eraser. And I'll use those sometimes where they'll do the problem on the board and then they hold the whiteboard up, and I don't have to move around that as much. And I can just look out and say, step 2, you need to check step 2, things like that. So that's how I kind of assess them as the lesson goes.
And then you said, you mentioned that the ticket out the door, and I think you used that this day. I guess the next day you'll come back and you'll review the same thing and tap in the prior knowledge again the next day. Okay.
My warm up, might be for the next day, label the parts of the radical,
Right.
just to see if they remember.